we need governments that work. And this is where this World Government Summit is so important, and I think an idea born 10 years ago that is growing and that is going to become increasingly relevant as the world goes by and moves on. Our good friend, His Excellency Minister Gargawi, likes to constantly say governments have 8 billion consumers to take care of. And it's an interesting analogy because I spent most of my life in business. I was for many years at the World Economic Forum, where we're sort of more focused on the private sector and the role of the private sector in meeting the challenges of our societies and our world moving forward. And businesses have to do that and stay competitive as well at the same time. And I think what we're talking about here is just the mirror image of this as well. Governments have to remain competitive. They have to remain relevant, much like businesses have to remain relevant. Governments are under pressure, different forms of pressure to perform, just like businesses, whether they're publicly quoted or whether they're privately held, are also under pressure to perform. So we've got a book now written and co-edited by our friends here that basically tell us how to do it. And over the next couple of minutes, we're going to dig in a little bit and I think maybe revisit from a different perspective some of the areas that Samia Ahmad was talking about earlier on the notion of partnerships, the notion of collaboration, the notion of how do you make this work, this concept of agility in governments. And there's no better place, as we know, than being in the United Arab Emirates, who have really mastered this and who remain on the world stage really one of the very few leaders in accomplishing and continuing to develop this. So I guess the first question I'm going to throw out to whoever wants to pick it up here, and let me just say also, if we have time, I hope we do, fireside chats, at least in my country, I come from Switzerland. It's not just a bunch of people talking by the fireplace, but it's, you know, the people in the living room and the people who are around the fireplace who also participate. So if any of you want to butt in, have questions or comments or experiences to share from your perspective, please do so. So the first question is, why this book? Why now? Is this something that was a long time coming? Is it especially relevant now? Was it relevant already 10 years ago? Where is this whole thing about agility coming, and why this book?
Okay, maybe I can start.
Okay.
Happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
And Raed is the dean of the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government. So.
Thank you, Fred. It's very good to be here and part of this forum. Where did this come from? I think when we think of the journey here, this evolved. So as a team in the school, we've been writing for years now about the future government. We wrote about innovation, we wrote about excellence. And in 2018, we had a brainstorming session because we have a yearly conference. And every year we decide what is the theme for the next year. And the theme Agile Government came up as part of the discussion because we were thinking, I think we had good foresight, because we had the conference in 2020, February 2020, and we went into lockdown in March. But we had decided a year earlier on the theme. So this has been evolving, maybe simmering in the background. We're thinking about how to describe our government, because we're focused on our government. We have global insights, but we're always interested in knowing how the UAE government functions. And of course, to help decision makers and policy makers with some insights, maybe with some recommendations, and also local governments as well. But this was driven mainly by looking at the UAE government, because if you recall in 2016, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, on the last day of the government summit in 2016, restructured the government, and it was the biggest restructuring since the formation of the country. And he dubbed it the government of the future. So we studied that government, we documented it, what forces led to it, what shaped it. And as we go, as we went from 2016 to 2018 and 19, we started seeing signs of agility in government. Now, just a bit of brief history. I think two events are key here. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid became prime minister in 2005. In 2006, he established the Excellence Program for the government, federal government. And many of you would know that that was transformative. It has transformed the federal government. So that was 2006. A lot happened. 2014, the Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Innovation in Government, which is hosting us today, was established in 2014. So it's excellence, followed by innovation, followed by the future of government of 2016. So it was inevitable that we're going to get to agile government. That's really the background. That's our thinking. And sure enough, in 2020, post-COVID government was actually dubbed agile government. So we had started on this book right after the conference in 2020, and we utilized the lockdown and COVID to brainstorm, invited a lot of cases. We did not want it to be only local, because agility is all about connection, is all about learning from everybody, private sector, public sector, everybody. So we invited writers from around the world, and of course we documented cases here in the UAE. So agility, I think, is here to stay. We debated a lot the subtitle of the book, Emerging Perspectives in Public Management, because when we said agile government, have we actually now a complete framework for agile government, theoretical underpinnings, and so on and so forth? We decided we're in transition. So this is emerging. There are lots of signs of it. I think the next book would be highlighting its complete pillars. Thanks.
Thanks.
So I want to add something. So it's not that this is new. They have been talking about it for years and years. I think if you go back on history, they talked about new public management, they talked about reinventing governments, but they all didn't actually sustain itself. So there was a nice study on reinventing of governments. It was a 25-year-old study. They went to those departments and those government entities that had done fantastically well, and they found out in 25 years they were no longer agile. The reason they were no longer agile is they began focusing on metrics. Okay, so it became about gamification. So we see that historically this works in small groups as experiments. It works with strong leadership, but it's difficult to sustain and scale. So the idea was to codify different lessons, different perspectives, gather them together. Some are theoretical, some are practice, but start the conversation. So we are in the early stages of starting that conversation.
So I guess COVID was a great time to write. Lockdown was a great time. A lot of books must have been written during COVID. But how do you? Is there anybody here who can define agility in a few words? What are we talking about here?
Meladina, that's yours.
Okay, so this is an interest. We had a lot of discussion on that. WEF was doing some work on agile governance, and then we were doing agile government, and we were thinking, what is the difference between the two? Are they the same thing? And we realized agile governance is bigger than agile governance is bigger than agile government. The reason why agile government doesn't really succeed is because we don't have the whole of government perspective on adopting values. The governance isn't through. We work in silos, different departments have different values, but we're not looking at the overall overarching thing. So going back to your definition, we think it is about steering resources, which we are custodians of, to deliver public value. Right? So that's our mandate. Wherever we work as a government, it's to the public and to create that value. And this is interesting because public value is a perception of that moment, of that time, across different groups. So how you do that, that requires agility.
Public value is a perception. Can you explain that? Because are you talking about the perception from the citizen's standpoint or from the policymaker's standpoint? Because I would imagine that if it's from a citizen's standpoint, it's your reality. It's not a perception.
A perception is your reality, isn't it? But look at the Edelman survey, right? Always we go, and one of the things we're very fortunate is there's a high level of trust in government in the UAE. But you look across the world, you will generally see business having a higher level of trust than you will see with government. Another interesting thing is when there is a failure, and Professor Wright spoke about innovation, when there is a failure, people are more forgiving of the private sector than of non-profit sector and of government. So this is also very interesting.
They're more forgiving for who?
Private sector.
Private sector. Okay. Yeah. Stock market hasn't been very friendly to some of these companies recently, but before we get to Fadi, who's the director of research policy at the school. Raed, it's just some. Do you have any recent examples? You said you're studying the UAE. This is the home base for the school. Any recent examples that come up to your mind about how this government has shown or practiced agility in concrete? Anything that comes up to your mind?
The latest, a number of things. The latest thing that comes to mind is the center has actually published a guide which is quite I think a unique one and an original one, a guide on structure and strategy based on agile principles. So this is advice for government entities published by the government, the center of government, to guide them through restructuring, being agile. What does it mean to be agile? That's a key point. Last year, in addition to that, the excellence model added agility as a centerpiece. So now auditors who go to examine government entities according to the standards, they look for evidence of agility and they require actually concrete evidence. So the government has the narrative, but they also put in place tools that allow it to test and measure how agile entities are. Of course, it is a learning process as well. And Fadi will probably speak about this better than me, but we sometimes confuse digitalization with agility. They're related, but they're not. Agility is not only digitalization, so it's other things as well.
Yeah, but that's exactly what we were going to get to with Fadi.
Yeah.
You may recall Huda Al-Hashmi, the Deputy Minister for Strategy in the Cabinet Affairs. Mm-hmm. A few weeks ago, she was telling us about how every minister in the country has to come up with 2 projects that their ministry is going to achieve. 2
Correct.
Innovative,
yes,
out-of-the-box projects. And not only are these projects tracked and measured, like many other things in this government. I think this government was one of the first to actually measure the performance of its ministries and government organizations,
Correct.
right? But what's extraordinary is she was telling us that even the budgets of these projects are agile, in that they can expand if something is seen as being promising but needs a little bit more resource in order to get across the finish line. That facility is made possible here. So, I mean, that to me is innovation at its best. But Fadi, true what Raed said, digitalization, I mean, and there's a lot of talk here about blockchain and crypto and all of these things. Is that what agility rests on? Can agility happen without digitalization?
So yes, in an essence, they are associated in a way today. They're not necessarily correlated.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a sense that you can be agile in the sense of increasing a budget or reducing a budget or removing a policy quickly or changing that policy if needed. But digital technologies and applications of digitization and utilization of big data and applying artificial intelligence when it's applicable can add value. So we talked about how agility in that sense is mobilizing resources in a very responsive manner towards achieving or generating public value quickly, swiftly, when needed, wherever it's needed. So in that sense, if that conceptualization of agility is what we are utilizing, then having assisting tools such as digital technologies that accelerate your ability to do so with and based on actual evidence, data, actual forecasting and foresighting that is driven by evidence is definitely going to make your life easier and you achieving such results in a way that doesn't leave a bigger room for error, bigger margin for error. So yes, it's a strong component, and in the governance of the future, it is a strong component that utilizing digital tools in responsiveness and being agile is an important factor. And let me give an example based on the questions that you just asked my colleagues. So what examples can we mention? Mm-hmm. So very strong example that ticks on the 2 boxes of what kind of samples of agility can happen and how digital technology played that role. So in the lockdown, the 1 month after we we decided and we held that conference, and we went into lockdown, and every country in the world needed to figure out how to educate their student and provide healthcare and all of that. The UAE had a very strong infrastructure digitally. It had utilization of digital tools and technologies by society that reaches almost, a full saturation of society in certain cases, whether it's mobile, whether it's internet connectivity, whether it's even social media usage, you name it. And we've done a lot of studies about that in the School of Government. Now, everybody said that, yes, we can apply technologies, but in some countries, internet wasn't able to adapt. The bandwidth wasn't strong enough or large enough for these video conferencing tools. The policies that existed and some restrictions of technological implementations in some countries also restricted the ability of utilizing such tools. The UAE had one of these restrictions, and they immediately decided to change the policy around that, to enable some of the existing technologies that are very vital today and still exist today, voice over IP, video conferencing, etc., to be available quickly. So it was a decision that took maybe hours, maybe a few days to take place to enable this to happen, where everybody in society can benefit from the ability of government providing services in a very difficult situation. So that's an example of how that change of policy happened in a very strong, speedy or rapid form that enabled this public value to be generated.
Extra. I think we learned yesterday that this country changed 800 laws and 800 new policies over the last 2 years. I mean, it shows the speed at which adaptation and thinking about the future is going on, to your point. Now, when you move that fast, Mel, Adina, I think there must be, you can't be adverse to risk, right? I mean, if you're wanting to embrace agility, you have to be taking risks as a government. So when you take risks or when you innovate, there can be certain repercussions, unintended consequences. I mean, have you guys thought about that in the book? And also, have you thought in the book about the issue of failure? Because failure is celebrated in the world of entrepreneurship. Fail, 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 learn from your failures and move on. Can one apply the same kind of thinking to agile governments?
You can, but we need to switch it a little bit. So I think we talk about risks a lot in businesses. I think what we are doing in government is doing policy trade-offs. So we are doing risks, but in a slightly different way, because our time horizon is longer, 10 to 15 years ideally, because some infrastructure projects take that long. Now this raises this question, can you fail fast and can you innovate quickly? So this is where things like government accelerators work, and I think UAE has a government accelerator that's doing extremely well. We're talking about sandboxing. These are important tools. So these are things we need to switch. But when we look at trade-offs, I just want to give you one example. I'm going to take ChatGPT because everyone's talking about it. I have to do this, yeah?
I was hoping that this would be the panel, the only panel in the government summit that doesn't
But I
mention
just want to
ChatGPT.
show you, so one of the
Meladina ruined it
things
for me.
policymakers need to think is systems thinking, right? So if you go down to ChatGPT, it's 175 billion parameters. So just think of the energy consumption. Data centers around the world contribute 0.3% of the total carbon. That is equivalent to the country of Argentina. Now think of everyone on ChatGPT using it. Think of the energy consumption that's there, right? So we have to think systems. It was 8 million documents. Whose documents and what is the bias over there? Now, when they trained ChatGPT, they used human labor. So behind the scenes, while we think of cool technology, we were using labor. We were paying less than $1 or $2 from Africa to go and train the machine. So we've also got to think about that. Then think about the 100 million people who downloaded it and trained the machine, because when you downloaded it free, you were training it. But now they're going to charge $42. So, I mean, it's a business model at the end of the day, but when you think systems thinking, we're thinking across the change. We're thinking sustainability, we're thinking people, because a government's job is to be people-centric. And I think that's the important thing. You cannot predict the risk. You can think possibilities, you can plan and prepare for that, but what we have learned with crises is we know it's coming, we do not know when it's coming. And this is where you need to be agile, because you may not have all the resources, but the ability to come together to work, to put the value people first, that's difficult.
Is that what you're calling messy and wicked problems in the book, or?
Messy and wicked problems are complicated problems with multiple stakeholders. And I'll give you another example. We did a study, I think Emmanuel and I, on COVID. The first 4.5 months, we documented 17 countries and all the policies they introduced. We looked at 87 policies. There was no order in which the countries introduced 87 policies. There were no priorities. So it wasn't necessarily health. And the funny thing is, when Wuhan locked down its borders, after that we had the Chinese New Year, and people still, their first instinct was to stop flights from Wuhan. I mean, this is globalized world. What makes you think people are only going to Wuhan and fly out? So again, when we look at policy making, I think it's that systems thinking and it's that, translating. It's hard in a high volatile environment. I think this is so difficult to do, and this is where I think in UAE we're so blessed. The concept of majlis, bring diverse people together, have a discussion, figure out what's working, what's not working, and be willing to, even if necessarily, go back and change things again. This is impressive.
So that there's a chapter in the book about that, if I recall correctly, right? About the communication, the importance of communicating
Absolutely.
with your citizens. So, I mean, we have little time left. I was going to ask for anybody here some bullet points on, we've been talking about the government and the importance of leadership, underscored by Riyadh, how from the beginning there was this vision of creating government that, as the session before we heard, encourages business rather than encourages regulation, and encourages innovation rather than encouraging regulation. But what is the role of citizens in this, and what is the role of business in this? Any thoughts that quickly come to mind?
So I can add maybe on the citizens and maybe leave Mike. So we're talking about generating public value, and generating public value need to be there an alignment that needs to happen, where public value is we're talking about the same thing between the different stakeholders, whether it's citizens or businesses, and of course the government. And without having that kind of touch points or channels of interaction and participation in our co-creation of these policies, and a measurement approach, ability to measure the impact of it's working or not working quickly and fast in a way that then feeds back as in a loop into the decision making and changing the necessary policies. So policy decay in that sense, what we also mentioned in the book, is something that is rigid within governments that takes place over time without the mechanisms of ensuring that these policies are reformed, changed. They become the norm, they become a self-driving force, and without the ability and the sense that we need to change things over time and reduce the window of examining this through these policy-making process that includes citizens as central stakeholders. Without that mechanism in place, then whatever change we might be doing may end up with the same results or along another cycle of policy formulation that might not generate public value. I'll stop here. I know you're out of time.
I see we're in the red now, but the extraordinary thing for me, as having lived here since 18 years, and I think when this concept of agile governments is practiced correctly, and I just relate it to the experience of my life here, is that it's not just the government that becomes agile, it's the whole country that becomes agile. And the entrepreneurial ecosystem that we have in this country is a result of this agility thinking. The reason why so many businesses are coming to this country to establish their operations is because there is agility in the country. There is innovation, and there is also that access with policymakers. I mean, it's not in every country that you see your government ministers driving their own cars, and its leaders sometimes stopping to help people change their tires on the sidewalk. These are all expressions that go to the deepest meaning of what this country is trying to achieve. The last comment I'll make is I met a government minister from a country that will remain unnamed on my way walking here, and I said, "Oh, we're here to launch a new book on agile government." And he said, "Wow, this is "Why is it so big?" he said. And I said, "Because it's not easy, and there's a lot to do." So pick up your copy. It's available to everybody. And thank you to you, the co-editors, of having created this practitioner's guide to Agile government. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.